Hey, hello, how are you? Welcome to the Otherppl Show. My name is Brad Listi, and I am in Los Angeles, California. Thank you for listening. It's good to be with you. Today on the program, my guest is Kathryn Miles, author of a new book called Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders.
I mean, every investigator that I talk to relating to this case can recite you chapter and verse details about these young women's lives. And they've since forged really powerful relationships with their families. So these investigators are hugely emotionally invested. But I think sometimes that emotional investment clouds us in ways we don't even realize it does.
That was Kathryn Miles, author of a new book called Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. Trailed is a riveting and disturbing book in the true crime genre. It's a deep dive journalistic investigation into the murders of Lolly Winans and Julie Williams, which took place in May of 1996 in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, not far from the Appalachian Trail. Lolly Winans and Julie Williams were young, they were idealistic, and they had fallen in love. They were skilled backcountry leaders, charismatic and bright and beautiful and beloved. These were experienced campers who knew what they were doing in the outdoors, and their murders remain, officially speaking, to this day, unsolved. So, as many of you guys know, I hiked a good portion of the Appalachian Trail myself in my 20s, my early 20s, the summer of 1997. I hiked through the Shenandoah National Park in July of 1997, just over a year after these murders took place. And I can remember distinctly seeing flyers posted at various lean-tos and shelters along the trail, explaining what had happened the previous summer and asking people for help with any leads and so on. So not exactly what you want to see when you're out camping, and it's something that has stayed with me ever since. These kinds of crimes, they're always haunting and disturbing and depressing to consider. And when you're out in the wilderness and you receive such news, perhaps doubly so. And this is another thing that Kathryn Miles is exploring very deftly in her book to unnerving effect. Trailed is not only about Lolly and Julie and their unsolved murders in 1996, it's also about the wilderness and the safety of human beings in the wilderness, and of women, and queer women in particular, in wild places, national parks. Places like Shenandoah National Park, which sees well over 1 million visitors in any given year. Once again, the book is called Trailed. I had a very interesting conversation with Kathryn Miles, and you will hear that momentarily. Today's episode is brought to you by IG, publisher of my new novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available now in trade paperback and ebook editions. The book is also available in an audiobook edition from Tantor Media and Highbridge Audio. The audiobook is narrated by yours truly and can be found wherever audiobooks are found. Be Brief and Tell Them Everything is a work of autofiction. It explores the themes of creation, creative exasperation, grief, loss, fatherhood, marriage, fate, failure, psychedelic reckoning, and more. It is a book that, over time, became about its own making. This is a personal story, a darkly funny one, I hope. And one more time, it is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available now from IG. On a related note, a quick announcement that I will be reading at Stories Books in Echo Park on June 5th at 5 p.m. here in Los Angeles. I will be participating in an autofiction reading series hosted by Caitlin Forst. Other readers on that evening include Cara Blue Adams, a recent guest on this podcast, Alexandra Jade, Oliver Zarandi, and more. So if you're in LA and you want to come out for the evening and have some fun, please join us on June 5th at Stories at 5 p.m. This episode is also made possible by Tennant's Cove Writers Retreat. If you are ready to get some work done on your manuscript, Tennant's Cove Writers is a new retreat and workshop that offers rustic and rural glamping, along with a warm and inspiring creative community. It is happening this summer, August 7th through the 14th, on a nature preserve of 150 acres in New Brunswick, Canada. The retreat is hosted and moderated by Melissa Scholes-Young, author of the novel Hive, and Peter von Zagazar, author of the memoir The Looking Glass Brother. On-site tuition plus room and board is $2,500, and there are only 4 spots available. This is a small, intimate, limited opportunity retreat. Participants can also arrange a full manuscript review for an additional fee. At Tennant's Cove Writers, they're looking for serious writers who seriously want to go into retreat and make some big progress on their projects. For more information, visit tenantscovewriters.com. TENNANTS covewriters.com, and join the retreat this summer. One more time, the website is tenantscovewriters.com. All right, so my guest today is Kathryn Miles. Her new book, Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders, is available now from Algonquin Books of Chapel Hill. Kathryn Miles is the author of 5 books, and her essays and articles have appeared in a wide variety of publications, including Audubon, Best American Essays, Best American Sports Writing, The New York Times, Politico, and Outside Magazine. I had a really nice time meeting Kathryn and talking with her about this new book, which is so heartbreaking, so gripping, so disturbing, and so illuminating in places that I was not entirely expecting. This is unsettling territory, but necessary territory, and I'm happy to share this conversation with you right now. Here she is, folks. This is Kathryn Miles, and her new book, one more time, is called Trailed.
I think, all too often, especially in the true crime genre, victims kind of become sidelined in favor of the perpetrators. The perpetrators kind of become these main characters, these sort of more rounded characters, and sometimes the victims just seem like objects. And when I went into this project, it was imperative to me from a moral and an ethical perspective, as well as a narrative one, that Lolly and Julie always remained the main characters of the story. Julie Williams was a young woman who was born and raised in a small Minnesotan town. She had a very close-knit family. She was a little shy and reserved, but super competent at everything that she did. She was fluent in Spanish, and as a high school student had started doing some translating for domestic abuse survivors. And she also had a vested interest in geology, which is what her major ended up being in college. She did a lot of missionary work in Central and South America. She did a lot of geologic work, both in Europe and in northern Minnesota, especially on Native American tribal lands. And so by the time she ended up at this outdoor organization called Woods Women, she had already kind of found a lot of competence for herself, both in terms of the backcountry and also in terms of some pretty hard scrabble places. Lolly Winans, 2 years older, she was 26 when she died. She grew up in a very affluent community in Michigan, a very wealthy family. That family had a lot of, let's say maybe dysfunction to it. As she would later talk about, she was an incest survivor, and coming forward with that story had really broken up the family in a lot of ways. She wandered a little bit after high school, kind of trying to find her niche. She was very outgoing, incredibly charming, had this great, really acerbic wit, loved the Grateful Dead, loved to go to jam band shows, loved to have a bottle of Corona in her hand. And she really found her niche when she arrived at Unity College, this small environmental studies school in central Maine. And at that place, she had committed to this idea that she was going to create a wilderness therapy program that would allow other sexual assault survivors to find the same kind of strength and redemption that she had found on the trail. So she arrived at Woods Women in May of 1995 to do an internship to complete her degree at Unity.
And Woods Women was in Minnesota. That was like Boundary Waters, is that right?
They spent a lot of time in the Boundary Waters. They were focused, they were based right outside of Minneapolis. And it was this really wonderful organization that had been created as sort of a corrective to Outward Bound, the National Outdoor Leadership School, these other sort of hierarchical outward schools. So Woods Women came out of folks who had an experience either at Knowles or at Outward Bound and thought, this idea of sort of increasing stress in a participant's experience really kind of only works for a certain type of participant. And for other people, especially people who identify as female or non-binary or queer, they're already coming with a level of stress to the wilderness. And so continuously stressing them is really only going to kind of disengage them from that landscape. And so that organization is where Lolly and Julie had met. And by all accounts, it was love at first sight. And so they had this very kind of cozy summer in this very sort of safe, holistic, nurturing, consensus-based environment where they felt really fairly safe being outwardly in love. And then as the summer came to an end, had to sort of confront the challenge of what is it to be LGBTQ plus in 1996, and how are we going to manage that?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things that I had to confront when I was reading, was thinking about where gay rights were in the 90s. It was a much different world. I like to think of my college years in Boulder as this sort of like wide open, free progressive time or whatever, but it wasn't. I mean, maybe it was in those little bubbles, but it certainly wasn't that way as broadly as it is now, though I guess things are maybe regressing, or they're trying to push things back, certain factions are anyway. But in the 90s, it was not necessarily as simple to be out and open and public about your gay relationship.
Not at all. And as I say in the preface of the book, I think it's really important to sort of consider and remind ourselves of the zeitgeist of the time. We have multiple states who are passing anti-sodomy laws. We have the Supreme Court affirming those laws. We're still really in the thick of the HIV scare for a lot of people. And this is the murder of Lolly and Julie is about 2.5 years before the murder of Matthew Shepard. And so there's a lot of very sort of anti-gay sentiment that's sort of reverberating through the country at this time.
Yeah, there was I think you documented in your book, was it an anti-sodomy law that passed in Colorado during that time? Or is that right?
That was right. And Oregon had narrowly defeated a very similar law that was basically going to make homosexual behavior, and I put that in scare quotes, illegal.
Wow. So not maybe the totally warm, fuzzy place that I like to remember, as I'm idealizing my college days. And Lolly and Julie were both abuse survivors. I think you mentioned Lolly being an incest survivor and how difficult that must have been. And then Julie herself was a date rape survivor, as were you, which you write about in the book. And you're also an outdoors woman. You love the outdoors and have gotten, I think, a lot of the same comfort and insight from the outdoors that Lolly and Julie got in their lifetimes. So those are the obvious lines of connection for you to these young women and to this story.
That's right. And I think you and I are probably just about contemporaries, because I graduated from college in 1996. And I had, prior to that final year of my studies, I had really struggled to come to terms with what had also been a date rape when I was 16 years old. And I hadn't told anyone. And as I say in the book, I went through what I now understand are a lot of fairly common responses, like this must have somehow been my fault, or I must have done something wrong, or I must have somehow brought this on myself. And so for those last 2 years of high school and then my first 2 years of college, I was battling with emotional scars that I didn't even understand I was battling with. And my initial response to all of that was just to try as hard as I could to get out of my body. And so I was studying the most esoteric theology and philosophy that I could. I was just rail thin. I was, I think 100 pounds, by that time, and just anything I could to sort of avoid my bodily self. But then I was taking an environmental studies course that had a mandatory backpacking trip on it. And I was totally unprepared. I had no idea what I was doing, but I really fell in love with the concept of backpacking and the idea that you could literally just sort of shoulder your most essential provisions and what you needed and supplies. And you could go out in the wilderness and you could feel strong and safe and empowered. And it was in that moment that I really found a way back into my own body. And so I had just newly discovered this sort of beautiful pastime that I kind of saw as my salvation. And then when I learned about these two murders and the murders of another very similar couple that had occurred also just off the Appalachian Trail, it really shattered my sense of security in the wilderness and really changed my approach to, all kinds of backcountry activities.
Yeah, so this murder that you're referring to, I believe, is the one that took place at the Thelma Mark shelter in Pennsylvania on a section of the Appalachian Trail.
That's actually a third. I was actually talking about the murder of Claudia Brenner and Rebecca Wright, which Claudia Brenner documents in a really amazing book called 8 Bullets.
Oh,
but
right.
Yes, the Thelma Marks is actually the third murder.
I can't keep track, to be honest. Like, I was going through your book after I'd read it, and there's so much going on. There's a complexity to trying to solve a cold case crime. And also, there's a complexity, just a basic fundamental complexity to unpacking all the different violent crimes that have taken place in the wilderness, which is one of the more unnerving aspects of your book. We like to think of the wilderness as being a safe place, removed from the perils of society and the inner city and all that goes along with it. And I suppose, like, maybe statistically it is, but it's like this book and these stories call it into question.
One of the things that I can hope that this book might be able to do, I really hope that it can spark a larger conversation about this issue of both equity and equality and access to wilderness, and then also safety in the wilderness. And one of the really disturbing things that I learned when I was researching the book was not just that violent crimes are underreported in our national parks and our other sort of national wilderness places, but there is no codified system for reporting crimes in the parks. It's sort of an ad hoc park by park system. And as both the Government Accountability Office and also the Inspector General of the Department of the Interior has found, is that these crimes are not getting reported. And similarly, instances of harassment, sexual assault, bad behavior that's occurring employee on employee in these parks is also radically underreported. We've seen some exposés that have been done in the past 5 years. Outside Magazine did a really big one looking at the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon and the pervasiveness of sexual harassment there. But it continues to be a really big problem, and one that I don't even think we really have the data for to really understand.
Yeah. And before we move on any further, I want to go back to you in Pennsylvania, having this great enthusiasm for the outdoors, and then, being on a section of the Appalachian Trail there and learning about this killing. It was, if I'm remembering this right, one person was killed, the other person survived. Is that right?
That's the Claudia Brenner case. The case that you're referring to at the Thelma Marks was a young couple, Molly LaRue and Jeff Hood, who had also been through hiking the trail. And they had stopped at this original, really kind of folksy old shelter that was known as the Thelma Marks shelter. And there they encountered a man who immediately murdered Jeff and then really brutally raped Molly repeatedly before he murdered her, disposed of their bodies sort of back behind the shelter, took their gear, and then just continued hiking down the trail and wasn't apprehended until he got all the way down to Harper's Ferry.
When was this again in time?
Yeah, and I'm going to have to guess on that. I'm going to say that that was late 80s, early 90s, but I would have to look it up to be sure. It was before Lolly and Julie. So I was going to graduate school out at the University of Delaware, which was right, in the foothills of the trail. And I would spend a lot of my weekends and school breaks backpacking. And as I write in the book, it was a November day in 1998 that I was doing a section hike. And I had stopped for what I thought would be the night at the Thelma Marks shelter. And I was, in my sort of sanctimonious way, really sort of distraught to see that the Appalachian Trail crew were building a brand new shelter. And I thought, oh God, this is like this relic of, the original trail. And how could they possibly tear it down? And I have this conversation with one of the trail crew workers who says to me, well, we have to tear it down because of the murder. And he then unpacks the story of Molly and Jeff, and I'm sitting right there, and in that moment it was just so inconceivable to me that something so terrible and brutal could happen in this place that I thought of as sort of, pastoral and almost sort of otherworldly in its safety. And, I didn't sleep a wink that night. I got home. We didn't even have Google then, right? So I was using, I don't know, Alta Vista to kind of look up, and I start to learn about these murders. And that was actually the first time I had learned of Lolly and Julie's murder. Somehow with college graduation and everything else like that, I had missed it the first time around, despite the fact that it was national news. And so now I'm sitting with this collection of murders on or near the Appalachian Trail, many of which, include women, multiple of which include women who identify as queer. And I'm sitting there thinking, how could I possibly ever go back out on the trail again?
Right, right. And then you went on to work at Unity College as a teacher, which is Lolly's alma mater, and which I believe to this day, like, memorializes her with a stone fireplace or something. Like, there's a memorial on campus that's prominent. And her murder obviously had a huge impact on what is a pretty small school. And that really, I think, began your deeper level of connection to this case and to Lolly and then Julie as well, correct?
That's right. So I arrived in fall of 2001. My first day of teaching at the college was September 9th, 2001. And my second day of teaching was September 11th. 2001. Man. And so everything about my teaching experience there was really sort of through the lens then of this, terrorist attack. But even before that, as soon as I had arrived on campus, Lolly was just everywhere on that campus. As you mentioned, there's this large stone fireplace in the Welcome Center that was dedicated to her. There's an outdoor leadership award that's given to a female student every year. And, it's such a tiny community. It was about 500 undergraduates when I got there. And, she was just everywhere. My colleagues had been her professors and advisors. I became friends with her friends. And she was there was this aura of her everywhere. So then flash forward just a few months to April of 2002. Campus still really rocked by September 11th, as I think we all were. And then John Ashcroft, the Attorney General for the United States, makes this very public live press conference that, again, is covered by every major media agency. And he says, listen, we've made an indictment in the Williams and Winans case. It's this guy named Daryl David Rice. He says he hates gays. We're going to treat this as the first federal hate crime in the U.S. using this brand new hate crime legislation. And then he makes this very weird pivot where he says, by convicting and executing Daryl Rice, we're not only going to bring closure to the Williams and the Winans family, but we're also going to bring closure to this grieving country who's trying to come to terms with September 11th and the hate crimes that it brought about. And so, of course, you've got, again, just the incredible sort of just arrival of the media once again, the national media back on our campus again. And, you've got the folks, myself included at that point in the community, simultaneously kind of scratching our heads and thinking wait, great, an indictment, but what does that have to do with September 11th? And then also most of us thinking, oh, thank goodness they finally got the guy, now the story is over.
It's funny, when I was reading that section of the book, I was like, I don't remember this. which isn't maybe that surprising because I don't have a great memory, but I feel like I would have remembered seeing that news conference, but I somehow missed it, in the whirl of life. And before we get too deeply into Darrell Rice, I want to visit the Shenandoah and the bridal trail and the crime itself against Lolly and Julie. Can you just just so listeners understand what happened? I mean, obviously the girls were killed, but they had been hiking there. They were on a backpacking trip. Can you just give kind of a broad strokes overview of what happened?
Mm-hmm. So, after they left Woods Women, Lolly returned to Unity. Julie decided she'd move in with a friend in Vermont, so she'd be close, but kind of not on top of Lolly in terms of trying to figure out their relationship. So they were about 5 hours apart. And it was a rocky school year for them. They were both trying to come to terms with their sexuality. They were trying to figure out what it meant to be in a lesbian relationship again in 1995 and 1996. And they had had some ups and downs. But that spring, they had really recommitted to each other. They had decided to move in together for the summer. It was going to be a really busy summer for both of them. And so they decided to take this, what would be about 10 days to go do this kind of easy breezy backpacking trip. They picked Shenandoah because it would be spring there, up here in Maine. As I'm talking to you, it's not spring. I'm kind of shivering in my office. But so Shenandoah, nice weather. And they didn't want a lot of mileage. What they wanted was a lot of time together. And so they set out, and we know from both their journals and from their backcountry permits that they weren't covering much mileage every day. They were just really taking it easy and stopping to swim and sunbathe and take a lot of photographs. At one point, they decided to descend down this disused trail called the Bridal Trail. And as I say in the book, about a decade earlier, it had been the actual bridal trail, which is to say the trail that all of these horse riding trips would go down from Skyland Lodge. And that required folks on horses to cross the only major thoroughfare in the park, which is Skyline Drive. And so the powers that be that controlled the stables, sort of decided, let's just keep these trail rides on one side of Skyline Drive so we don't have novice riders on horses trying to cross a busy street. In the decade that followed, this trail became completely disused. It disappeared from some maps. To this day, if you don't know exactly where the trailhead is, it's really hard to find. I have to kind of walk up and down Skyline Drive a little bit to find it. And I can't even tell you the number of times I've been there at this point. So nobody really thought about this trail and nobody really knew about this trail. Somehow Lolly and Julie find themselves on it, and they hike down about a third of a mile, and then, being good backcountry campers, they bushwhack about 200 yards off the trail and establish what is ultimately a completely hidden campsite. And so they set up camp there. At some point, the perpetrator comes upon them, and what follows is an incredibly organized and sophisticated crime. This is a person who manages to subdue 2 women and a dog. He's come with what experts call a murder kit. So he's got a bag that has duct tape. It has a knife. We think it has a gun. He brings gloves, possibly a change of clothes, subdues the women, separates them, sexually assaults Julie with a vibrator, murders both of them with a very sort of horrendous slash to both necks. And so then disappears. And because this is a backcountry crime, and because the women are out of range and cell phones don't really exist, no one even knows this crime happens for days. And that's going to complicate investigations and all sorts of things later on.
Yeah. And, I think it might be useful to listeners who have never visited Shenandoah National Park to get a topographical idea, a picture of it. What I remember from my hike on the Appalachian Trail is how excited I was to hike the Shenandoah, because everyone was like, it's pretty flat. You learn to love when you're through hiking or doing a long hike flat, because there's so many uphills and frankly, downhills can be difficult with a heavy pack too, sometimes more difficult. And so the Shenandoah National Park, as I remember it, is basically like Skyline Drive sort of traces the spine of this mountain range. And the trail sort of does as well. And it rises up out of this beautiful valley, and there are lots of great views, lots of tree cover. In rainier times, lots of running water. Like when I was there, all the water sources were down because there had been this drought. So when I was reading your descriptions of the park in the summer of 1996 with like these rushing rivers and like overflowing creeks and stuff, I was like, wow, I remember struggling to find water to fill up my bottle.
Yeah.
But beautiful place. Lots of wildlife because there's no hunting allowed inside of national parks. So the Shenandoah is one of the sections of the trail where, deer will not run away from you. Like they'll just be sort of like staring at you, and bear are all over the place. I remember seeing 4 or 5 bear in the park at not that far of a distance. So it's a lovely place.
It's a complicated place too, because, it's really close to Washington, D.C., so super accessible for folks. Skyline Drive, which runs, as you say, down the backbone, is super hectic in the summer. But step a half mile off of Skyline Drive and it feels like incredible wilderness. It's also, a park with this really difficult history. Thousands of Appalachian homesteaders were forcibly evicted to build the park there, and their descendants still feel like that's their land. And so it's always had a huge problem with poaching, both of animals like bear and then also with things like ginseng. And it's been really beleaguered in terms of its staffing and its ability to sort of meet challenges, even including things like acid rain and smog. And so it's beautiful and also really fraught. And I think that's what makes it such a great sort of environment for this crime to happen and succeed in some ways.
Well, yeah, it's one of the few sections of the AT where there is like a thoroughfare, like a automotive thoroughfare running at close range to the trail itself, and it's one of the few sections where you're crisscrossing with the road and like able to get like a restaurant meal or take a shower or whatever. So but that's another reason why I think through hikers like it, because it's like, ooh, some modern conveniences. But I take your point. It does complicate things, and it does, create opportunities for a lot of different kinds of people to wind up in the park and on those trails, interacting together. And there was a page in the book that I dog-eared, and it was really where you start to get into Darrell David Rice, who, as you mentioned a moment ago, was the person that John Ashcroft and the DOJ of 2002 indicted for the crimes. And I believe it was July of 1997, you said that Darrell David Rice, you described Darrell David Rice committing an assault within the park, which is how he came to law enforcement's attention with regard to Lolly and Julie. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it was really, after this murder happens, after rangers eventually find the bodies, it is, by their account, the fog of war, right? This is a joint FBI, National Park Service, law enforcement ranger case because it is National Park Service land. So you've got these two different agencies, very different cultures within them, kind of butting heads and trying to figure out how to work together. They go through dozens and dozens of suspects, including some of the rangers who the FBI began to suspect. And as you say, by the summer of 97, the case has basically grown cold. As far as they're concerned, they've exhausted all of their possible suspects. And they're, I think feeling frantic is probably too strong of a word, but they're certainly feeling the urgency of needing to somehow move this case forward. And at that point, Darrell Rice, who is a young computer programmer from outside of Baltimore, who has lifelong mental health challenges, bipolar and schizophrenia, his life is completely unraveling by this point. He's lost his job. He's not taking medication for his mental illness. And he's been spending a lot of time at his dad's house, which is right outside the park. Darrell Rice is a really avid cyclist, and, he would spend a lot of weekends cycling through the park. On this particular weekend in July of 97, he had been fired. He's, like I said, really kind of emotionally and psychologically unraveling. He's been up for days, smoking a ton of marijuana, and he's driving kind of aimlessly through the park. And he spies this Canadian woman who is cycling. on the main drag. And he, for whatever reason, kind of fixes her in his sights. He drives back and forth a few times. He's yelling expletives at her. He throws a soda bottle at her at one point. He runs her off the road and kind of has these sort of like menacing hands in front of him. And he says, "I'm going to get you." And at that point, she manages to run away to get to a little store and to call for help. As soon as this gets back to the Rangers think to themselves, "We've got our guy." They initially apprehend him and they say, "Daryl, did you attack that cyclist back there?" And he's like, "No." And they're like, "Daryl, did you attack the cyclist back there?" And he's like, "Yeah, I did." And he said, "Hey, did you ever catch the guy who killed those two women last summer?" And at that point, the Rangers are like, "This has got to be the guy." So he was arrested for this 97 assault. And while he is arrested and waiting trial for that and being held, they use that as an opportunity to really put the focus of the investigation on him. And frankly, from July 1997 until today, the focus of the investigation has never left him.
So I want to talk about law enforcement, but before I do that, I want to ask you to describe how you got from somebody who knew about the murders, was experiencing a place and a culture that was very connected to them at Union College, or Unity College. What was it? Unity. Right? Yeah, Unity. To a woman obsessed with the case enough to write a book about it. You just give my listeners, many of whom are writers, like that story in a nutshell. Like, how did you make the transition? When did the switch flip? Like, when did this get real?
Yeah, so I think like a lot of people, when this indictment gets announced in 2002, I just assumed it was case closed. And I just assumed that justice had been served. And then in 2015, I had left Unity teaching full time. And at that point, I was working as a trail correspondent for Outside Magazine. Summer of 2016, the FBI comes out with this huge sort of national media push to say that they're looking information to lead to the conviction of the 1996 Shenandoah murders. And I'm thinking to myself, wait, I thought we already got that guy, And so I had arranged a few preliminary interviews with the FBI agent in charge. And he made it very clear that he believed that Rice continued to be the suspect. In 2004, the indictment against Rice was dismissed using a legal concept called without prejudice. So basically what that means is the prosecution goes to the judge, and in this case went to the judge the day before jury selection in Rice's case and said, "Listen, we feel really confident in our case, but for whatever reason, there's been sort of a procedural snafu that's not going to let us proceed the way we want to proceed. So we're going to dismiss the charges, but we reserve the right to bring them back whenever we want." And so Rice continues to live in this state of sort of double jeopardy. And when I was talking to the FBI in 2016, they really made it seem like, look, we just need that last peg so that we can really make sure that this is going to be a successful prosecution. And despite what I know I'm supposed to do as a journalist in terms of being objective, I think I really went into the story believing that line of thought, that they just needed that one last thing to convict Rice. And it wasn't until I started digging into what I thought was going to be a really easy feature story, and I started getting access to court documents, that I really began to realize just how thin the case was against Rice. And along the way, I also started to see just what were indefensible lengths that the FBI and the Justice Department had gone to try to pin this on Rice, to the exclusion of other seemingly obvious suspects. And so then I had, sort of a growing number of what looked like mistakes, if not malfeasance, on the part of the Justice Department. And at that point, I was like, all right, this isn't a 5,000 word story. This isn't a 10,000 word story. This is a full length project.
Yeah. And there's a great part of the book where you're describing visiting, I believe, like an FBI facility where they are processing evidence. And forgive me if I'm getting the chronology wrong or whatever, but I think it's like that visit and then they take you to the park and you visit the scene of the murder in the company of FBI agents and also park law enforcement, correct?
Yeah, after some back and forth, the FBI curated this really kind of first-rate tour for me, which in hindsight, I think is because they saw this as a really great kind of PR opportunity. So I was able to spend a day at the forensic lab at Quantico Marine Base. And then they amassed this collection of investigators, past and present. We were just this parade of humans who then went down to the murder scene. And it was there that I started to really see the tension between the National Park Service investigators and the FBI agents. And it was then, as I say in the book, one of the lead Park Service investigators takes me aside at the end of the tour and gives me his card. This is like sort of out of Hollywood noir, right?
Well, I know. I don't want to interrupt, but I'm just saying, like, this description of the tension between the two departments, like, it's total Hollywood. This is always the case. And it makes me think of men. It feels so male, like so masculine, this kind of energy where it's like, I'm in charge. No, I'm in charge. And it's like, guys, we're trying to solve a double murder here. Can we just work together? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, it just seems like a power struggle and it kind of misses the point of the whole thing. So I don't know. That's my little aside. But I do want to name this Park Service law enforcement official, Tim Alley, because he plays a pretty significant role in the book. And he's the one who hands you his card and says, I'll tell you everything I know, basically, right?
Yeah. And, to his incredible credit, he sat for hours and hours and hours of interviews with me, sometimes with other investigators. It was really important to me that I kind of approach this from as many possible angles as possible. So at one point, a former sheriff's deputy who had grown up in the area, she travels down to the park with me, and, she's part of talking to Allie as well, too. And then eventually I make my way to Rice's defense team, which includes a woman named Deirdre Enright, who went on to found the Virginia Innocence Project. And there's this tension, again, almost kind of Hollywood tension between Deirdre Enright and Tim Alley, who, as I say, both really good at their jobs, fundamentally opposed to each other in terms of their take on the case. And so they become these kind of two main characters and foils for me as I'm trying to sort out all of the information and what it means.
Yeah, so Tim Alley believes that Darrell Rice is the killer. Deirdre Enright, who runs the Innocence Project, is his defense attorney. And, I think defense attorneys often work for guilty people.
Yeah.
But she deeply believes in his innocence, which needs to be underscored, to a degree that might distinguish itself in her career. You know what I'm saying? He's one of these people that she's like, I know he's innocent, basically. She has that conviction. So there's a great tension there. And I think now is a good time to talk about law enforcement. And one of the things about your book that stands out to me is the ways in which it portrays the complexity of law enforcement, these, interdepartmental conflicts and, power struggles, the unique challenges presented by crimes that occur outdoors in terms of gathering evidence, securing a crime scene, in terms of, locating fingerprints and evidence, all the rest. It's all a little bit more difficult when you factor in things like rain, for example, or animals and, all this different stuff. But then I think in a contemporary context in particular, what I kept thinking about was like, wow, so much of the conversation that I hear in the culture about law enforcement nowadays is these like systemic issues within law enforcement, like racism, police violence, the ways in which police have abused their position of authority, particularly with respect to communities of color. Like, these are the kinds of conversations that I often hear. And they're not without merit. These are vital discussions to have. But in your book, and with respect to the murders of Julian Lawley, and also the other murders that you describe in the book, what we're up against is the vital need for effective law enforcement to help solve violent crime when it happens, and the ways in which it often fails. And I don't know, I found that to be striking, and I found it to be a necessary piece of the puzzle when it comes to thinking of law enforcement in a holistic way. Do you see what I'm getting at? Like, I just feel
Absolutely.
like, what happens when you need a cop?
Right.
When something terrible happens and you need law enforcement to come in and do its job, you want it to be effective and you want these people to be super competent and to do their jobs well. And it's a really complicated, difficult job. And I think you do a great service to that truth, because, man, I came out of this just being like, it's got to be really tough to be somebody assigned to one of these crimes and to have to live with it and unpack it and be responsible for it. It's also frustrating at times to read about the incompetence and these sort of like juvenile squabbles that happen between departments and, all the things you've talked about. And it did a nice job of making what I imagine to be very complex real. So I will let you talk more about this, but I'm imagining you have thoughts, having spent so much time with people who work in these fields and having experienced the frustrations that I'm sort of alluding to here.
Yeah, and I really sort of appreciate what you're saying. And for me, I think certainly with this particular story, I think separating the individuals from the institutions is really important, right? Tim Alley couldn't be a better guy, and he couldn't be a better investigator, and I could say the same thing for other investigators who worked in this case. But there is a systemic problem, both in terms of how we train law enforcement and then also kind of what we grant law enforcement. Most federal law enforcement officers are trained at a single federal law enforcement institute that's based in Georgia. And they all go through the same homicide training and the same evidence collection training. And as you pointed out, none of that helps with a wilderness case, right? The step number one is secure the premises, put tape across the door, measure the room in which the body is found, note every entrance and exit. None of that makes sense in the wilderness, right? Where a crime scene begins and ends is impossible to determine. As one FBI expert was showing me, we were standing at the crime scene and we were looking at hundreds, if not thousands of rocks around us. And he was like, one of these could be a murder weapon and 999 of these could just be rocks. And how do you know? So that's part of it. But, and in the book, I don't think by now it's probably a secret that, that I really take issue with the sort of institutional problems and sort of longitudinal problems with the FBI that go back really to its founding. It's always had a really mushy mission. We've given the FBI a lot of power to police itself. And, increasingly there are reports from governmental agencies like the GAO about where the FBI is falling short, and where
what is the GAO?
The Government Accountability Office. So we have these statistics that are really sobering in our country, right? We have 250,000 cold homicide cases in the country. Now, obviously, those are not all or even mostly the FBI. Some are local jurisdictions and state police and things like that. We've had something like 3,800 exonerations of innocent people in the last decade, of people who were convicted for violent crimes, but who in fact were later exonerated because advances in DNA technology showed that they were innocent. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of rape kits that haven't even been tested yet. So those are cases that are nowhere close to closure. And that's what I mean when I say separate the individuals from the institutions. It's no one individual's fault that our sort of forensic judicial processes are crumbling, if they were ever even solid together. But these are really solvable problems that for whatever reason as a country we've chosen not to address.
And when you speak about crime in the wilderness, we touched upon this earlier about how it's very easy to romanticize the wilderness and think of it as this otherworldly place that's removed from the stresses and darknesses that plague more populated zones. But I believe it was near the page that I dog-eared where Daryl Rice committed this assault against this Canadian woman. And forgive me, her last name begins with an M, I believe. It's
Malbasha.
Malbasha, that's right. And so I was in the Shenandoah in July of 1997. So, of course, I was like, whoa, I think it happened a little bit before I arrived there because I I came into Virginia like right around the 1st of July and probably didn't make it to the Shenandoah until towards the end. But there, I believe in this section of the book, was a cataloging of other crimes and assaults and weird incidents on the trail that sort of made my hair stand up, because I was like, wow, like this is more than I would have expected. And like, it's disturbing. And it's also like, what do we not know? Like it was you talk about these things being outliers. It's like, oh, well, yeah, a violent crime on the trail happens once every 10 years. It's like a shark attack. You shouldn't be something that dictates your behavior. You could still get in the ocean basically. But this made me rethink it. I was like, wow, this is quite a lot of weird, grim behavior happening in a pretty concentrated area of the trail, all within a pocket of the summer, So can you speak to that?
Yeah. After this happens, after the Rangers determine that this is in fact a double murder, one of the first things they do is they use the cameras that are at the entrance stations of the park, and they get the license plates of all the cars that came and went that week. And using that, they're able to come up with this spreadsheet of who was in the park. And as you say, and I kind of just sort of laugh, not because it's funny, but because of the absurdity of it. The number of registered sex offenders, escaped felons, people who are convicted for violent crimes, people who are armed and dangerous that show up in this list was utterly astonishing to me. And then you have these park employees who start reporting each other as well. So-and-so has a bloody knife under his bed. So-and-so murdered his girlfriend. And, I'm reading all of this and I'm thinking exactly what you just said, which is, wow, I've spent a lot of time in national parks. Have I been shoulder to shoulder with all of these folks and not even realized it?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was thinking. And I was reflecting because there was a guy in Virginia that I met who was about to go into prison. And I hiked with him for a couple of days. Nice guy, about my age, but it was like a cocaine thing, So it was like, well, I didn't feel any kind of, I was like, he's young and he was from Appalachia and I think just got into trouble, and was going to go to prison. So there was that, but there were also a lot of people struggling with addiction who were out there. And let's be honest, like if you want to hide, if you want to get away from it all, if you're trying to transform yourself, I mean, I don't think there's anybody out there on a through hike who's not dealing with something. But, you want to believe that the wilderness is this safe zone. But then when you think more deeply about it, especially when it's a long trail like the AT with all this notoriety, there's a certain logic to the idea that there would be some unsavory people out there trying to sort of stay below the radar or just be weird without consequence,
Yeah, and I think that's probably always been true. But, if you look at the numbers of people who are either through hiking or section hiking, when you and I started doing this, it still hadn't spiked, right? We still hadn't had Bill Bryson's Walk in the Woods. We still hadn't had Cheryl Strayed's Wild. And those two books alone, created this exponential rise in traffic on the trails. And in some ways, it's been really fantastic, right? It's really taken what was very sort of monolithic about the types of people who went to the trail, and it really broadened that in terms of gender and race and sexuality and even just body types, right? You see a lot more diversity on the trail, but you also see a lot more people profoundly underprepared. We see a lot more people, hiking the trail, not to kind of get well or find nature, but to party or to hook up. And so the number of cases of like sexual harassment of hiker on hiker that, have been reported recently is kind of disturbing. And then, yeah, you also start to see people who are using the trail for other ends, to sort of, as you say, drop out, or to hunt, And since I started this book, there have been other murders, including other murders on the trail itself. And, as somebody who loves that place so much, it's really hard for me to confront all of that.
Yeah, but likewise. And, as you describe the aftermath of Lolly and Julie's murders and law enforcement's response, one of the things that's frustrating is just the pace of investigations. Some of this is a necessary thing. They have to be painstaking. You're sort of gathering evidence. At first, they thought it was a murder-suicide. That was kind of infuriating because it was like, really? Like they were both bound. They were tied up And they were killed with a slash to the neck, each of them. That's a murder-suicide? That seems really...
before that, it was a bear attack. The
right.
official report was that it was a bear attack. Very
Right.
sophisticated bear.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, there's those elements of it that I'm less sympathetic to. There's other elements of it where, it's just hard work, and they're out there in the night, and there's the weather, and they're trying to do their best, and there's, and then, you describe, as we've spoken about, the Darrell Rice case, and that coming apart for the prosecution. And then there's your role in it, where you're kind of sorting through all this and talking to all these people and having extended conversations with Tim Alley, who was in the Darrell Rice Did It camp. But then you meet Deirdre Enright, who had been presented to you, I think, by Tim as somebody who's, not the greatest character. But you wound up really liking her, and you paint her as in a very sympathetic light, as somebody with great charisma and somebody who is very skilled at what she does.
And it was a real leap of faith for me. I went in really suspicious because I think I had a lot of prejudice about defense attorneys and the work that they do. I think I thought defense attorneys defend guilty people. And, so Deirdre plays a pivotal role in season 1 of Serial. I had heard her there. I had also heard, as you said, some unsavory things about her. And so I had contacted a few friends of mine who do a lot more journalistic work in the world of the Innocence Project and exonerations. And I had asked them to kind of vet her for me. And even after she and I started working together, I was still really suspicious. I was like, is this woman just trying to sell me a bill of goods to get her client free? As it turned out, she had 22 boxes of evidence that the prosecution had originally not shared with the defense, that she kind of keyed into during these discovery exchanges. It was all being kept in a storage unit, the kind of place where you'd store, furniture or a boat or something. And she had bought a photocopier and brought it over and photocopied thousands of pages of evidence. So very quickly it became not whether or not I trust Deirdre Enright, but the fact that Deirdre Enright is giving me access, unfettered, unprecedented access to 22 boxes of evidence having to do with this case that I just wouldn't have had otherwise. And it was really that evidence, working through it initially with her and then just working through it, frankly, on my own, that eventually led me to kind of come to the same conclusion she did, which is not only did Darrell Rice not do it, but there's this other suspect who I think we can make a very strong case for as the perpetrator.
Yeah. And, I don't think I'm going to ask you to talk too much about that because I feel like readers should be able to discover that part of the book on their own. But I do want to talk with you about the impact that these killings had. Obviously, you can imagine how difficult and traumatic it would be for immediate family and friends, surviving the loss of loved ones in this way. That's sort of a given. But one of the things that I think you do nicely is you really articulate for the reader like what an impact it has on people like Tim Alley, even on Deirdre Enright. I mean, she's living with a lot of ghosts, and these people carry this stuff with them. You yourself, spending all these years thinking about this and doing all this research and living with these images and these crimes, it really takes its toll. And not only that, and I think this is where it really came home for me in the book, there are people who were in the park in the summer of 1996. I believe that was it. I'm thinking of the women that you went and visited in the upper Midwest. Was it the Anns? Is it the Anns? Okay.
I call them that because 3 of the 5 are named Ann.
Yeah. So these were hikers who had planned this great backpacking, trip as a group in the summer of 1996, correct?
And, they were so excited about it. They were new to the sport. And, for reasons that no one has been able to explain to me, the park made the decision to withhold news of this double murder until the media found out on their own. So for close to 48 hours from the time the bodies are discovered millions of visitors are streaming into this park, having no idea that what could very likely be a serial killer is still in the park. We have no reason to believe this person is not in the park. And rangers are instructed to obfuscate. Park officials have decided that they're not going to say anything. When the media finally kind of ferrets this out late in the day on a Monday, the park continues to try to say that they think it's a murder-suicide, and so these women, the Anns, who for me are emblematic of all of the visitors who were at the park at that time, they're hiking through and they're starting to hear kind of rumors and whispers. They're approaching rangers and saying, look, what's going on? Are we safe here? And by the time they find out what's actually happened, they feel so profoundly betrayed by the park that there's this doubling of the trauma, right? There's the fear, I think, that comes with realizing that someone just like them had been brutally murdered. And then there's also this sense of betrayal that they're like, look, the park and rangers are supposed to be protecting us. And we feel like you kind of left us out to dry and you left us in this incredibly vulnerable position. And that's something they're still dealing with today. It was very clear to me meeting with them that they have not resolved that issue yet, 25 years later.
Yeah. I mean, these crimes, they have a big psychic impact. Friends of Lolly and Julie, I really feel for them, especially at a young age like that. It's just like, it's always like really hard to fathom whenever you hear about a violent crime like this, but especially with young people, like young women, like just at the beginning of their lives. It just is so senseless. And, without giving too much away, there's a pretty strong case to be made that there could be or could have been a serial killer responsible not only for Lolly and Julie's murders, but also for a string of similar crimes in that particular region. And I'm trying to think of, I think I have the names written down. There were young girls, Alicia Showalter Reynolds, the Colonial Parkway killings, including the murders of Kathy Thomas and I believe Becky Dowski, Thelma Scroggins, Sophia Silva, and Carolyn McDaniel. And then there's Kristen and Katie Lisk. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's the full list, but it's quite a lot when you start to stack it up. All within, how many miles of Shenandoah National Park?
Yeah, take the Colonial Parkway one out of there, and it's a pretty close radius. And one of the things I was really happy about with Algonquin's publishing of the book is they included a photo inset that I think maybe you didn't get in the galley, where there's a series of photos, both of Lolly and Julie and Deirdre and Tim and some of the evidence. And we also had a really talented cartographer do a series of maps. And one of the maps includes the radius of these murders and where the women's bodies were found. And I think seeing that and seeing the kind of circle that it makes around Shenandoah is really chilling. And I think it confirms what some FBI profilers and forensic psychologists thought from the very start, which is that this was the work of a single serial killer.
There's somebody who says, and I believe it's maybe an FBI guy or some other law enforcement official, who says, if there's more than one person responsible for all this, like this area's got a big problem. Like there's very rarely like two serial killers or,
duking it out, right?
Yeah, duking it out in like
rural Virginia.
Yeah, rural Virginia. So it sort of strains credulity. It's hard to imagine that there could be more than one person responsible. There are also similarities in terms of the way these women were killed. Some of the, I feel like there's some crossover, though not perfectly with each and every one. And, it's pretty infuriating to read about and also confusing to read about how much resistance within law enforcement, within the FBI ranks in particular, there was to pursuing the notion that someone else might be responsible, someone other than Darrell Rice, that these crimes might be connected, that there are leads we should be chasing here. And it's almost like a willful resistance. It can seem that way. But it's also like a maddening lack of resources, human and otherwise. There's just a backlog of cases, and it's like, well, we just don't have the manpower to handle it all. And so, I mean, how do you, if I'm the family and friends of anybody who's been lost in this way, and that's what I'm told, that's not going to sit. That's a harsh thing to say to somebody who's grieving the loss of a loved one in this way. So it's hard not to feel angry. And it's hard not to wonder too, like, what the hell's going on? Like you talked about that Ashcroft announcement in 2002. It's pretty difficult not to view it through the lens of public relations, and it's like, wow, that's really, if that is indeed what was happening, like, you know what, the country's traumatized. We need a solution to this case. We need some positive PR for the department and for the country. We need Americans to feel safe, like we're on task. So we're going to make a big to-do about solving this, even though we really have what is a fairly thin case, on paper, or like from an evidentiary perspective. And you go, man, that's pretty, like, what's the word for that? You know what I'm getting at? Like, it's like, how can that be what's guiding you? You should have a different North Star if you're in law enforcement than what's going to make the department look good. But it's not uncommon for big institutions, powerful institutions, to place their own reputations above maybe their mission and importance or what's right.
Yeah, and I really think that it's something that we really need to address as a nation. I am flabbergasted by the number of exonerations that are happening right now. I am flabbergasted by the number of innocent people who, having served decades in prison, are coming out, and they're shattered now too, and I talked to multiple FBI agents who were very frank with me about the level and the degree to which confirmation bias had sort of erroneously defined their work. I talked to 2 FBI agents who worked very closely on the Yosemite murders, which, Cary Stayner was eventually convicted for. And they said to me flat out, like, listen, we had it in our head that we knew who the guy was. And so we were ignoring everyone else. Like, we talked to Cary Stayner and we were like, this guy doesn't matter because we know who did it. And then Stayner went on to commit at least one more murder, and those agents who I think were really just frank and candid and willing to kind of take the blame, in the interview, they know what happened. They would like to go back and redo things. And I think that, we all, and especially institutions of power, have to start accounting for this idea of fallibility and the fact that there is no such thing as objectivity. And, and I became very aware at multiple moments in the book how little objectivity I had. And I try to be really honest with readers about that. I think these big systems like the FBI has not yet had that conversation on a larger level.
Yeah, I guess there's just a lot of pressure, internal and otherwise, to solve these things, especially the ones that are higher profile or have captured the national imagination in some way.
And I think have captured the emotional attention of the investigators themselves. I mean, every investigator that I talk to relating to this case can recite you chapter and verse details about these young women's lives. And they've since forged really powerful relationships with their families. So these investigators are hugely, as you said earlier, hugely emotionally invested. But I think sometimes that emotional investment clouds us in ways we don't even realize it does.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think Tim Alley might be, might fall under that umbrella. This is a guy who really cares and is a good human being. And, we should say, like, the law enforcement officers who have to investigate these crimes, like, they're not made of steel. Like, these people carry this stuff. Like, it haunts, the really good ones anyway. Like, it haunts them. They carry it with them. It's personal. And so it's understandable that there would be a deep emotional need or drive to want to solve the thing and to find someone who they can say, this is the responsible party. We've brought some closure to this, or I know that word is loaded, but you know what I'm saying? Like, I understand that at a human level. And you'd like to think there would be like systemic ways from a training standpoint or just from an operational standpoint that big systems and organizations like the FBI could try to guard against these emotional impulses, even when the emotional impulses are coming from a good place, to try to make sure that the facts are truly followed and that the right people are held responsible, In this era of CSI and other true crime TV shows, we love to believe that a forensic lab can determine this for us. And I think as a country, we've
very wrongly just tried to side on what is ultimately very subjective science. You know, we're only now starting to unpack the way in which things like hair analysis, you know, bite mark analysis, even, you know, trace DNA, and, you know, let alone like the genetic DNA type stuff that's happening with 23andMe. I mean, this is fallible on both an ethical level and also on a scientific level. And we're in a phase in our country right now where we're over sciencing the science, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, you do a great job of like unpacking the forensic side of like law enforcement and, you know, homicide investigations. You know, all that stuff has changed so much in our lifetimes. And I don't know, I think from like an outside observer standpoint, when I'm just sort of like, oh, DNA evidence, it's rock solid. It's 100% accurate. You know, when somebody's DNA is found at a crime scene, then it's infallible, but it's more complex than that. And I'm not going to, I mean, your book does posit something of a conclusion, but again, I'm going to let readers come to that on their own. I would like to end by asking you how you're doing. The book does end on a high note. You know, I will say that, you know, you personally end on a kind of high note where you're in a better place than you often were over the course of writing this book. And I was thinking of the movie Capote, and I was thinking of Truman Capote because of his book In Cold Blood, and having read about what a toll that book took on him. This is not uncommon for people who work in this mode. For writers who are out there, and I have a lot of writers in my audience, you know, who might be interested in long-form investigative journalism or crime literature, and this kind of thing. Can you just talk a little bit about navigating the emotional terrain of it?
Yeah, and you know, in some ways I'm the worst person to talk about it because I know that I'm an emotional sponge, and I have always had a hard time not having an emotional response to stories. You know, I was writing a story a while ago about these critically endangered right whales getting caught in nets and dying of infections. And I was just regularly weeping, you know, reading these scientific articles. And, you know, that's definitely, I don't know if weak is the right word, but that's definitely sort of an aspect of my character that I really have to check with. I was thinking a lot about people like Michelle McNamara, David Carr, other people like that, for whom they became utterly sort of inescapably consumed by these projects. And I knew I didn't want that going in. So I tried to create really good boundaries. For me personally, I decided I wasn't going to work on this after dark. You know, that was one thing I tried to do. And it's still left a real mark, you know, that's, probably just a scar I'm going to carry with me. But the thing that I kept going back to again and again and again was what an opportunity it is to be able to tell some of these stories, these narratives and these legacies. And yes, this is a story of murder. And yes, this is a story of like brutality and violence, but it's also the story of these two utterly remarkable humans who had already done incredible work. And it's also the story of a love story that was kind of ahead of its time in terms of, again, like the social milieu. And so like in my darkest days, I kept having to go back to that. You know, I kept having to go back to the reason I was telling the story. And I kept having to go back to, you know, the friends and family who wanted closure. And I kept thinking, well, you know, what we do is a kind of vocation, you know, and if this vocation can somehow lead to a greater good, then what right do I have not to do it?
I think you say in the book, like, what right do I have to look away? Something like that. And that spoke to me because I often talk about how like I can't watch violent things the way that I used to. Even like a shoot 'em up movie. It doesn't have to be true crime or something, but I think since I had kids, or maybe I'm getting older and softer with age or something, but it affects me so much. And especially like at night, like watching a really violent movie or something that's like, I can't watch Mindhunter or whatever before bed. I don't know how people do that. But I do sometimes check myself and think, you know, we have to bear witness, especially when a great injustice has been perpetrated against innocent people. And I can imagine how you get to a certain point in your relationship to this story And you just say, okay. And you take on a sense of responsibility, I guess is what I'm driving at, where you feel like, well, if I don't, who will? The story needs to be told, and maybe I could shed some light. Maybe I can help advance the cause of trying to understand what really happened. And I guess the last thing I'll ask is getting to a place of comfort with respect to surviving friends and family. I imagine you had to try to build, you describe building trust with Julie's family, I believe. Lolly's parents had passed away by the time you got into this book, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that right?
Well, her father was in late stage Alzheimer's. And so from an ethical perspective, there was just no way I was going to approach him. 2 books ago, I wrote a book called Superstorm, which was based on an article I had written for Outside about the sinking of the Bounty during Superstorm Sandy. And 2 individuals had died aboard that ship. And that project was such an exercise in developing empathy for me and realizing how long it takes to develop trust with a source that I think we tend to just sit down and be like, okay, first question, without remembering that we're sitting with a person who's experienced incredible trauma, who doesn't know who we are, who has every right not to trust us, right? And no reason to trust us. And so we don't get to just jump in. Like, that's not fair. That's not right. And so, I learned a lot with that project about relationship building, which is not really taught in J school or an MFA program, So realizing that relationships, obviously professional relationships, but relationships nevertheless have to be formed, it has to be a 2-way conversation. It can't just be the consumption and the solicitation of information. And so I have learned that, and I continue to learn that with every story about tragedy that I write. And it's something I take really, really seriously is what is it to be the carrier and the bearer and the vessel that a story is going to be placed into, and how can I be the right vessel for that story?
Well, you've done an admirable job. We've talked about a lot of what your book covers, but not all of it. And I hope we've given listeners enough of an overview to dig into it. It's a wonderful and unnerving and vital exploration of not only this crime, but, what this crime is emblematic of culturally. And I think it sheds light on our criminal justice system and ways, like we've talked about, that law enforcement needs to be systemically improved so that we don't have so many cold cases and so many crimes like this that go unsolved. And there's more to it, but I just really enjoyed it, and it brought into context, my time on the trail in '97 and all the rest. And I just really am grateful to you for the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for so much nuance and depth of conversation. It's just such a wonderful delight to really kind of sink into a really meaningful conversation like this. So I appreciate it.
All right, you guys, that was Kathryn Miles. Her new book is called Trailed: One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. It is available now from Algonquin. You can find Kathryn Miles on the internet at kathrynmiles.net. She's also on Twitter. Her handle over there is @Kathryn_Miles. Again, the book is called Trailed. It is absolutely riveting. Go get your copy right away. The Otherppl podcast is offered freely. The entire archive of this show is made available to listeners free of charge. It is a listener-supported show. So if you like this program, if you get something from it, if you listen regularly, I hope you will consider supporting it. You can do so for as little as $1 a month over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. That's Patreon, patreon.com/otherpplpod. There are different tiers, different levels of support. As you move up the scale, you can get stuff, a t-shirt, a tote bag, coffee mug, book club subscription, what have you. Patreon.com/otherpplpod. My book, my novel, Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, is now available from IG in trade paperback and ebook editions. You can also get the audiobook read by me, if that suits you. Go get a copy of Be Brief and Tell Them Everything wherever you get your books. If you would like to help this program, a great thing to do is rate it and review it wherever you listen. If it's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, what have you. Give it a rating, give it a review. It helps other people find the show. It helps the show in the algorithm. The Other People podcast also has its own app. Did you know that? The app is free. The Other People with Brad Listi app. Go search for it by name wherever you get your apps. Otherppl. The Other People podcast also has its own YouTube channel. The entire archive of this podcast is available on YouTube. Go over to YouTube if you're a YouTube person. Search for the show by name, Otherppl with Brad Listi, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's free. Doesn't cost anything. Also helps us find new listeners that way when you subscribe. So, great talk today with Kathryn Miles. And I have some other ones in the pipeline that I think you're going to be excited about. So stay tuned. I will be back next Wednesday with another conversation. All right? Hope you're doing well out there. And if you're not doing well, just remember, it doesn't last. Nothing lasts.